You are listening to Business Talk podcast. I am your host Deepak. We are honored to welcome Dr. Benjamin Shestakofsky, faculty member in the Department of Information Science at Cornell University, as our esteemed guest on today's podcast episode. Dr. Benjamin's research centers on the relationship between work, technology, organizations, and political economy in the age of artificial intelligence. More broadly, his research and teaching interests include the sociology of work, technology and society, economic sociology, qualitative research methods, and organizations. His academic articles have been published in leading journals such as Socio-Economic Review, Theory and Society, Big Data and Society, Work and Occupations, Socius, International Journal of Communication, and Teaching Sociology. His research and commentary have also appeared in media outlets including the New York Times, National Public Radio, USA Today, San Francisco Chronicle, Financial Times, Los Angeles Review of Books, Fast Company, Stanford Social Innovation Review, Forbes India, Axios, and a publication of the World Economic Forum. His research has been recognized with 3 article awards from sections of the American Sociological Association, the Best Paper Award from the section on Communication, Information Technology, and Media Sociology, the Star Nelkin Paper Award from the section on Science, Knowledge, and Technology, and the W. Richard Scott Award for Distinguished Scholarship from the section on Organizations, Occupations, and Work. Behind the Startup received an honorable mention for the section on Labor and Labor Movements Distinguished Scholarly Book Award in 2025. His work has been supported by Russell Sage Foundation, the W. E. Upjohn Institute of Employment Research, the Horowitz Foundation for Social Policy, and the UC Berkeley Institute for Research on Labor and Employment. Dr. Benjamin holds a PhD in sociology from the University of California, Berkeley, and previously served as an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Pennsylvania. In this episode, Dr. Benjamin shares valuable insights from his award-winning book, Behind the Startup: How Venture Capital Shapes Work, Innovation, and Inequality. This book, Behind the Startup: How Venture Capital Shapes Work, Innovation, and Inequality, investigates the role of financiers in shaping our technological future. So without further delay, let's welcome Dr. Benjamin to the podcast. Dr. Benjamin, it's an honor and privilege to have you join us today.
Thanks for having me, Deepak.
Professor, what led you to embed yourself inside a tech startup for 19 months? And how did this experience reshape your understanding of innovation in Silicon Valley?
So I got interested in studying startups because prior to going to graduate school, I had worked for a startup. A friend of mine from college uh, sort of asked me out of the blue once. He said, "Hey, listen, I'm starting this company. I got some funding. Would you come join me?" I ended up being, I think, employee number 3 there. And what really fascinated me the most about it was basically the fact that my friend, who knew nothing about running a business, had somehow convinced someone to give him, I think it was maybe like $500,000 to start this company, to try to get something off the ground. Um, it was fascinating in part because it failed. It showed me that one of the most important uh, things that you have to do in starting, a tech startup and a VC-backed tech startup in particular is to tell a good story, right? To convince people that what you're doing has a lot of promise. He not only was able to get funding, but he had convinced a writer for the New York Times Magazine to write a feature story on the company. And the story was timed to be published exactly when the website launched. So the story's published, the website launches, and it just crashes immediately. And that was sort of where things went with that company from there. Eventually it failed. Eventually I moved on. I decided to get a PhD in sociology, went to graduate school. But the question sort of stayed in my mind around how is it that there's all this money out there that's available for people who, are starting ventures, are able to tell a good story, may or may not actually have the skills and the chops to execute. Um, and that's sort of the experience that got me interested as a graduate student who was interested in issues around work and labor, to actually find a startup where I could, as you said, embed myself, where I could work alongside the folks who, were working at the startup and sort of learn by doing, to learn by, you know, taking on various organizational roles, understand from the inside how things worked, and ultimately, sort of what I took away in terms of your question around how this reshaped my understanding of innovation, and how it happens in Silicon Valley. I think ultimately what I took away was sort of an appreciation, less for the technology, which is often sort of at the center of our discussions about innovation. What's the hot new thing? What can it do? How is that new technology going to change how we live or how we work or communicate? But really an appreciation for the funding that's driving the creation of these new enterprises and really that's driving the direction that they take. So maybe I'll leave it there and I'm sure we can get more into that as we go on.
Very insightful. Professor, your book challenges the common narratives that blame algorithms or greedy CEOs for tax harms. Why do you place capital, specifically venture capital, at the center of the story?
So, there are a lot of stories out there, both sort of in the press, and also in the social sciences, which is sort of where I make my home. There's a lot of stories out there about, uh, what's gone wrong in the tech sector, right? Obviously, uh, innovation has brought us a lot of great things, but there's sort of increasing recognition of the harms. And, there's a lot of accounts that focus again on, sort of whether it's these greedy or sort of toxic founders who have these outsized personalities, or, worries about algorithmic systems run amok, and the bias, and unfair outcomes that they generate. I'm not saying that these are not actual things that are going on. They certainly are. But to me, what's most interesting is actually to sort of look behind those phenomena, right? And think more about, well, why is it that we keep getting these founders and CEOs who seem to be so brash and reckless? And why is it that we keep getting these algorithmic systems that seem to place, uh, you know, um, growth imperatives over issues of fairness or accountability? So, I think that if you want to tell the whole story, you have to step back a little bit and think more about the funding model that's driving innovation, both in Silicon Valley and really around the world. We have a model, the venture capital model, that's based on investors, making sort of a large number of investments, buying equity stakes in a large number of small, new companies, new startups. And really, the model is the expectation of failure, that 9 out of 10 of those companies are not going to make it or not going to amount to much, but that 1 out of every 10 is going to be, hopefully from the point of view of investors, a massive success, on the order of an Airbnb or a Facebook or an Uber. And all of the increased valuation of that company is going to mean massive returns for investors that can more than make up for all the losses in the fund. And so really, I think what's going on in the world of venture-backed startups is that it's more than just that this money is out there to support startups. The way that the funding model works actually structures startups, right? It compels them to shoot for the moon, to shoot to become one of those 1 in 10 that makes it really big. And I think we can't really adequately account for, again, the people who are leading startups and what they do, and the products that they create and sort of some of the downstream effects that they can have unless we really pay close attention to the funding model and the investment pressure that's sort of compelling them to do what, those of us who have observed startups for a long time know that they do, right? They move fast and break things. They can play sort of fast and loose with the law, with labor regulations, and really sometimes even with the livelihoods and well-being of their users. And so I think you can't tell the story of innovation in Silicon Valley and beyond uh, unless you really keep venture capital in your sights and try and pay close attention to how the inner workings of tech startups are really aimed at producing that sort of rapidly inflated valuation that VCs are looking for.
In part two, you highlight the often invisible human labor, particularly offshore labor in the Philippines, behind so-called automated systems. What did you learn about the hidden infrastructure of innovation from that context?
Yeah, I think a lot of things came into my view from sort of seeing in this startup that I was studying, which had an office in San Francisco where there were about 20 people working, doing sort of, engineering, design, business operations. But then there were two remote work from home teams of independent contractors, one of which, as you mentioned, was in the Philippines. There were about 200 people working from home, mostly online, doing these sort of routine information processing tasks that make a lot of software systems and machine learning systems work. Um, so, a few things come to mind here. So one is that I think sometimes it's not always appreciated how, for some software developers, full automation is not necessarily the goal. The team that I studied was, a team that sort of discovered that they could do more and they could experiment faster if they combined, their software development with human labor. Sometimes they would just sort of bring people in to act as if they were a software algorithm before they coded something up. And that allowed them to test, is this really a good idea? Are the users going to like this? Without having to put in the time to, change the actual code base of the product. So, I think this is a team that learned that full automation was not necessarily going to be the most effective or efficient way forward for them. And I think it's also worth noting that in a lot of cases, full automation may not even be possible. As this team of software engineers, continued to experiment and innovate, they were constantly pushing at the frontiers of what the software could do. There's a great book by Mary Gray and Siddharth Suri called Ghost Work that I think describes this phenomenon really well. That, you know, to expect that we'll be able to, automate these kinds of behind the scenes workers out of the picture, I think that often sort of assumes that the software is going to be static. And that's not true. It's constantly changing. And, it makes a lot of sense to keep bringing people in to try and supplement and help to support or improve the software. Um, so, I think people, human beings tend to be uh, flexible, especially in this era of global labor sourcing. They can be relatively inexpensive, and for those reasons, really tend to complement these kinds of processes of software development. And finally, of course, as a lot of people have pointed out at this point, you can't really do contemporary AI without this kind of behind the scenes human infrastructure. You need ground truth. You need data to be labeled. You need data or users or content to be classified. There's so many use cases where it just doesn't make sense to assume that it can be done without this kind of, what you called, I think, like hidden infrastructure. So, I think it brings up a lot of important questions, some of which I discuss in the book around, given that this hidden infrastructure exists and seems so important to software development today, it's also important to think about issues like, what is the quality of this work? And of course, how can the quality of the work be improved?
Dr. Benjamin, you describe how startups mix high-tech tools with low-wage labor to resolve organizational tensions. How does this hybrid model reflect broader trends in the gig economy and platform capitalism?
Yeah, I think that's an important question. If we're thinking about sort of, yeah, this mix of high tech and low wage work, right? So much of the tech innovation that occurred during the era that I was studying this company, in the 2010s, the last decade, so much of it was based on this platform business model, right? Using technology to connect two parties either, more efficiently than had been done before, or even potentially connecting people or parties that were unable to be connected before. And of course, yes, there's enormous efficiencies to be gained through these kinds of processes, enormous value can be created. To me, I think what your question points to is this broader question of, okay, if all this value is being created, then who's capturing that value? And I think there's a lot of cases out there that have been, I think, well discussed in both sort of journalism and the social sciences, platform companies like Uber and DoorDash and Instacart, right? Cases where, on the one hand, a lot of new economic opportunities created, and on the other hand, there's just this massive creation of value that is being reaped disproportionately by the people at the very top of the chain in the tech ecosystem, right? By investors and their limited partners, by founders, by, to a lesser extent, sort of the earliest employees in these companies. And what you often see as you sort of follow these gig economy platforms is that the rules, the policies, the wages that the workers are subject to, they can change very frequently. They can lead to a lot of disruption in workers' lives. And so, yes, for many, they find that given their available options, that these are sort of a better choice. But you're also sort of, again, if you sort of zoom out and look at these workers in the context of the entire ecosystem that they're embedded in, you can see things happening like when Uber IPO'd. The top five investors in Uber, or at least the top five equity holders, which I think might have been three investment funds and two co-founders. Um, but those top five stakeholders took home over $27 billion in stock. And at the same time, Uber gave bonuses to qualified drivers, like people who'd been driving for Uber for a long time, that averaged $273, which is basically the equivalent of a few pennies per ride that they had ever given. So, it's sort of a way of looking at, again, both, yes, there's new opportunities on the bottom, but also we're seeing sort of the disparity between the haves and the have-nots growing pretty massively, while the people, many of the people whose efforts are really essential to creating that value get left behind when these companies IPO or get acquired.
Professor, you write that venture capital pushes startups to scale at all cost. What kind of distortions or dysfunctions does this scaling imperative introduce into everyday work life within a startup?
Um, I think, it depends, at least in the case I studied. Again, this was a company with headquarters in San Francisco. There was a remote team in the Philippines doing this routine information processing work. And then there was a small team of customer support agents working from home in the Las Vegas area. And, I think depending on where you look, you can sort of see, I guess, what you're calling distortions and dysfunctions kind of funneling down the chain. Like if you start in San Francisco with the software engineers, you can see, and I talk about this in the book, cases where, for example, one software engineer has an idea that he thinks is going to make the product actually just better for users, create a better user experience. And he runs it by his boss, the director of engineering, and the director of engineering says, I don't think this is a good use of your time because what investors are looking for is scale. They're looking for really fast and really precipitous user growth. And this thing that you're suggesting to improve the user experience is not going to lead to that kind of growth. So I don't think you should be working on that right now, right? Instead, what the engineers were usually working on were, lots of experiments and changes that were sort of designed to test whether they could get that really fast user growth, bring a lot of people in really quickly. Um, and so, some of these things can end up as I don't know if you want to call them dysfunctions or sort of second order effects when you start going down the chain. For example, when you look at uh, what you might call the frontline workers, right? The people who actually interact with the users rather than the software engineers. These are the phone support agents in the Las Vegas area. Um, well, when this product is constantly being experimented with, it's constantly changing. Um, the fee structure is changing, the user interface is changing. Well, the users who actually use the product, they just want a product that works consistently. They want it to help them accomplish the things that they're trying to accomplish. And they're not necessarily interested in all of these tweaks and changes that are not designed for them. They're designed to attract more and more people as quickly as possible. And so, you often end up with users who are angry, upset, confused with the product and how it works and how it's changing. And then they're constantly coming at these phone support workers and, trying to get satisfaction from them, get a better explanation of what's going on, try and convince them that these changes shouldn't be made. It should go back to how it was. But of course, the phone support agents have no power over, the shape of the product. So you end up with, these frontline workers who are sort of getting squeezed in a sense from above and below. From above, they have to constantly follow all these changes that are being orchestrated by the team in San Francisco. And from below, they're hearing all this anger and confusion from the users of the product who are trying to sort of, just like they are, trying to keep up with what is going on here. And so, I think that scale at all costs ethos, it creates a lot of organizational problems that then end up having to be solved. And, as we were just talking about in terms of some of the disparities in the tech industry, usually these kinds of problems, especially these user-facing problems, are solved by people, again, who make very little money. And even though their efforts are so essential to making these companies work and making them valuable, they don't generally get to share in the wealth that's created, right? They don't, in this case, they're independent contractors. They don't get stock options like the workers in San Francisco.
Professor, could you unpack how the pursuit of scale impact company culture, especially for workers outside the core technical or leadership teams?
Yeah. I'll try and sort of briefly again just mention these three teams. So the team in San Francisco, I feel like anyone who's familiar with sort of Silicon Valley startup workplaces would uh, not be surprised by what I observed in this company, what I call a culture of speculative optimism. It's a bunch of folks in an office kind of experimenting with a lot of product features, watching the numbers go up, getting really excited about it, and sort of, they're in an environment where your ability to secure resources as a company is predicated in part, as I mentioned at the beginning, on your ability to tell a good story. And so everyone, in a way, participates in sort of, pumping the company up and, getting excited about its potential and conveying that excitement both to each other and to outside parties as well. Uh, Interesting thing, something sort of unexpected for me was that for these folks in the Philippines who did sort of this behind the scenes work that really just sort of helped provide a nice, stable infrastructure that the engineers in San Francisco could innovate on top of. Um, for them, this work was much more stable than I expected. They're kind of doing this click work. Anyone who's familiar with like Amazon Mechanical Turk is probably going to be familiar with the kind of task they were doing. Very routinized click work, and these processes didn't change very much day to day, week to week, month to month. And so the culture actually was sort of this sort of familial culture that was based on expressions of loyalty and gratitude and even love that, I think sort of reflected the stability of this work. And also, I think workers, as I've written about in the book and elsewhere, workers really wanted to cultivate in their bosses in San Francisco sort of a sense of obligation to keep this thing going and keep that workplace stable. Now, for the folks in Vegas, as I mentioned, doing customer support work, um, where they're really dealing with sort of the front lines of organizational change. I talk about what I call sort of a culture of frustration. Um, Things are very difficult. The work is really hard. They're taking a lot of abuse from customers. And because the engineers in San Francisco are so focused on um, so focused on experimentation and innovation, they don't really have the time or resources to fix the stuff they've already built. Bugs sort of linger and fester. And again, it's the frontline workers who have to sort of engage with the users and help them through all the problems. And so they feel sort of ignored and neglected in a lot of ways by this, by I think the what are the ramifications of this constant pursuit of scale?
The book makes clear that the benefit of tech innovation are concentrated among a small elite. What structural changes in the VC model or startup ecosystem would be necessary to make innovation more equitable?
Um, I think it's a really important question. I'll just start by saying I'm not out here saying I think we should abolish VC tomorrow. Obviously, there's a lot of wonderful, fun, useful, productivity enhancing, health enhancing, well-being enhancing innovations that have come from Silicon Valley startups. Um, and a lot of things we just, we have and we don't want to live without them. And I understand that and I appreciate that. But at the same time, I do think that it's possible for us to think about alternative ways of funding innovation that aren't necessarily designed like VC is designed to, return incredible wealth to the stakeholders that are sort of at the very top of the chain, and to, achieve scale at all costs, which is often at the cost of a lot of people at the bottom of the chain. There's some really interesting models that exist out there already. There are, for example, some privately owned tech companies that never took VC funding. One really interesting example is Craigslist. Great book about this by a former colleague of mine, Jessa Lingle. And Craigslist like has barely changed since it's been probably been around for around 3 decades now. And it's not harvesting user data, it's not serving ads, it's not changing. Um, it only charges employers and landlords to use the service. It's a profitable company, but because it's privately owned, the founder, Craig Newmark, who's sort of a Web 1.0 true believer in an open internet, like he's able to balance his values with the profit motive and try and come up with, a model that works for him. There's also, of course, successful tech nonprofits out there that are mission driven. We all know about Wikipedia. There's companies like, or organizations like Amara, which is a translation and transcription service that has much higher wages for its gig workers than VC backed and for profit gig platforms. There's cooperatives that are kind of collectively owned and operated by the workers themselves who use them. There's a famous example, well, at least in the world of platform co-ops, a famous example of a company called Up and Go in New York that serves house cleaners. And, instead of taking the revenue in from these house cleaning jobs, taking a big chunk out to either, invest in growth or return to investors. 95% of that money is going back to the cleaners themselves who use the platform. So, I think there are other models out there that exist, and what we haven't yet done is maybe thought long and hard and done the work of trying to figure out how do we promote these alternatives. And I think there's also things, aside from promoting alternatives, there's also things we could do right now to, at least within the VC system we have, maybe make, or at least reduce sort of the structural power that investors have. The VC field, I guess our industry, really started to boom in the 1980s after some changes in the US to public policies like a reduction in the capital gains tax rate, a change in Labor Department regulations around what kinds of investments pension funds are able to make. So, those are changes that can be reconsidered. We also have big tax loopholes that benefit investors in the US, carried interest loophole, qualified small business stock exclusion. Enforcing antitrust law can make some of these business models less profitable for investors. So I think there's a lot of things we can do both inside the system we have and also sort of trying to think outside of the box a little bit more as well, to, maybe bring that ethos of experimentation that supposedly defines Silicon Valley into the way we think about how innovation gets funded.
Professor, if we were to reimagine the startup not as an asset for investor but as a public good, what would a more just and inclusive model of tech innovation look like?
Yeah. I think one idea that I think is really interesting, there's a sociologist named Mike McCarthy. He has a new book out called The Master's Tools. And it's about this concept of democratic finance. Um, so McCarthy's written about this idea of, for example, what would it look like if, we supplemented the investment landscape we have now with other options like, say, a public investment bank, right? Like, what if members of the public could get together, deliberate, and vote on the kinds of innovations and the kinds of projects that we collectively as a public want to support, right? To create public goods. And we could put some taxpayer money into these things. And then when some of these projects succeed, instead of the instead of the gains being privatized, they could go back into public coffers. In fact, right now, we have, at least historically, in the US, that this may be changing a bit now, but we have had massive public investments in science and technology that have created, have led to the creation of numerous incredibly valuable innovations. There's a great book by Mariana Mazzucato about this, where she sort of like deconstructs the iPhone and all of the uh, publicly funded research that led to the creation of the technologies inside the iPhone. And so, I think this idea of like a public investment bank is just sort of trying to push us towards thinking about, well, yeah, what if the public funds, the taxpayer funds that we were putting into science, technology, and innovation, what if we had vehicles for more of those, the gains that they produce to go back to the taxpayers and back to kind of serving the public?
Professor, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. As a sociologist, what do you hope policymakers, technologists, and investors take away from your book when thinking about future of work and innovation?
Okay, so policymakers. And I think this goes for policymakers and also, in a sense, for citizens as well. I think we all sort of tend to take for granted that the VC model is the best way and maybe even like the only way to fund innovation. And again, I'm not saying that everything that comes out of the VC model is bad, but I am saying that I think there's more we can do as a public, and there's more that policymakers can do to sort of try to diversify our innovation portfolio beyond this one model and to explore, as I've mentioned, some of these other funding models, how to promote these other funding models that, may, rather than being explicitly designed to enrich people who are already extremely wealthy, are designed more in mind with having multiple stakeholders' interests at heart. So, I think that's something that policymakers could think about. For technologists, I've given a lot of talks on this book, and I often end up talking to technologists or, students who are aspiring entrepreneurs who tell me, like, I hear you, I agree. There's a lot of people who have accepted VC funding who really aren't happy with the model either, and sort of how it forced them away from their vision for their product. And so, what I often say to them is, listen, I think you're in a really difficult situation because you don't have a lot of alternatives out there. For many entrepreneurs, VC is often sort of the only way to get their thing off the ground. There's not a lot of nonprofits and foundations out there that are funding innovation like the stuff that we're talking about. I do think that folks who are getting into VC funding need to make sure they understand the risks, understand that the investors are diversified. They are not. They only have, this one company that they are fully invested in. And I think you should be honest about your priorities if you're doing something like this. If your primary aim really is to sort of change the world for the better, you might really think twice about VC because VC is going to pressure you, even if at first, if they say they agree with your vision, if that doesn't produce the rapid growth they're looking for, they're going to exert a lot of pressure to sort of steer away from that mission. I think it's important for technologists to think about how do we share the wealth? How do we make sure that all of the people who are contributing actually get a stake in this company and not just sort of like the privileged workers in the headquarters? I think it's really important for technologists to listen to those frontline workers and actually pay attention to the people who are there talking to users rather than just kind of looking at the data dashboards and how close they are to meeting the expectations that the VCs have set out for them. And of course, to explore whether there are alternatives out there for them. And I think just in terms of investors, investors love to think of themselves as visionaries, of course, but again, I think it's kind of striking when it comes to the funding model that they promote. Really, almost everyone in the investment space is following the status quo. And it might be interesting if more investors thought about creating new models, even if it's just to sort of supplement what they're already doing, right? Maybe there's LPs out there like foundations that really care about things like, labor conditions or other social outcomes. Maybe it's possible to serve them with a fund that, pairs a focus on profits with, with a real genuine um, focus on those issues and not just sort of some window dressing that really, when you dig underneath, is still focused on growth at all costs. I just think there's more opportunities out there to think about sort of long-term value creation and sort of multi-stakeholder models that deviate in some ways from sort of this imperative, right? That traditional Silicon Valley VC is facing to just get those user metrics to skyrocket as quickly as possible and then say, we'll figure out all the problems and, all the other stakeholders later. So those are some thoughts I have on that.
Listeners, that brings us to the end of today's episode. We are deeply honored to have had Dr. Benjamin Shestakofsky join us and share his thought-provoking insights on the inner workings of the tech industry, the power of venture capital, and the broader implications of work, innovation, and inequality. His research not only sheds light on the often invisible dynamics that shape the tech economy, but also invite us to critically reflect on the financial structure driving technological change. Behind the Startup Book is a compelling contribution to the ongoing conversation about the future of work and the kind of innovation that serves as many, just a few. To our listeners, thank you for tuning in. If you found today's conversation engaging, be sure to check out Behind the Startup and explore more Dr. Benjamin's work. Until next time, stay curious and keep asking the hard questions. Dr. Benjamin, thank you for your time, your scholarship, and for helping us better understand the world behind the screens. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Deepak.